Thank you. Got me a new phone. I'll be sending you my number here soon. We are going to be in Mark chapter 8 this morning. So be turning there, talking about those words that Robin read for us and does a great job when he reads those, the words that were spoken to Peter, or spoken about Peter. And we're going to talk a little bit. Peter had kind of made a mistake, and we want to talk, I think when the disciples make mistakes, we want to see what that is, because we don't want to make those mistakes. And so we're going to look at that this morning. This is a part of our lesson series called Follow Me. It's about discipleship. This year at Westside, we've adopted a new mission statement: love, share, disciple. You heard it in the video earlier. And we've been focusing this fall on what it means to make disciples, to obey Jesus' command to go and make disciples. Neil and I have been preaching lessons from the Gospel of Mark that we think point out to us, show us what Jesus did and how, as Jesus followers, we can also do. Last week, Neil talked about touching the untouchables when Jesus touched the woman with the bleeding issue, and then the dead girl that he raised to life. Would have been unwarranted for a Jewish teacher of standing in his community, and yet Jesus did that. And if we are his disciples, we will touch the untouchables in our community as well. This morning, we're going to look at Mark's ultimate challenge to his disciples. Mark gives this ultimate challenge in a number of different ways in his gospel, but nowhere clearer than he gives it here. When he talks about staying on mission by denying yourself, taking up your cross, and just following Jesus. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. What does it mean to do that? How are we to be about denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and following Jesus? In my counseling practice, I've had a number of folks who have asked difficult or even strange questions. And because I'm a Christian counselor, a lot of times those questions take the form of have religious attachments or associations with them. And sometimes they're difficult to answer. Sorry, Zach, I'm going to need a password.
Fix this.
Yeah. All right, it's his phone. There we go. Thank you. One of those questions that I was asked in a counseling setting, this was in another place, was a man asked me with his wife present. I was doing some marriage counseling, and he said, "Now, if Jesus were to be alive today, don't you think that he would hang out in the bars a lot?" Interesting question, isn't it? I mean, at first blush, the answer is, well, no, of course not. He wouldn't be in a bar. And then you think, well, he did eat with tax collectors and sinners. Well, maybe, I probably at some point, depending on. But in this case, I knew that wasn't really what the man was asking. I knew that they were in a situation where where his wife had been complaining that he was spending too much time in the bars, where his drinking had led to difficulties in their relationship, and she was encouraging him to drink less or give it up altogether. She was encouraging him to avoid the bars altogether. And he was using his faith, which he had at one point in time. He wasn't involved in a church or seeking his faith at that point in time. She was. They had met when they were kind of in a wild phase of their lives and gotten married. And then both of them had become Christians. And then after kids, he had kind of settled back into his old ways while she continued in her Christian ways. It's a theme that we've heard a number of times. And it was what was happening to them. And in his kind of pulling away from faith, he was using Jesus and what he knew about Jesus to justify some of his behavior. And while we may think it's funny to as we think about what he was doing and the messages that he was sending there, what he was trying to do with the message of the gospel, and I don't know, at some level it's offensive that he's trying to do that with the message of the gospel. And yet, sometimes I wonder if it's not something that we do as well, that we try to put Jesus in our box rather than to get in his box with him and to be what he wants us to be. Let me ask you this. If we refuse to associate with people of lower position, claiming that Jesus would not want us to be with such people, are we not doing such things? If we treat people from other kinds of churches with contempt because they might not be attending a faithful church, if we treat people of other racial or ethnic groups in condescending ways, are we not putting Jesus in our box and not involving ourselves in his? When we abandon our church or our faith, when things get tough, someone hurts our feelings, or our culture turns against it, are we not putting Jesus in our box rather than stepping into his box? I think it's easy to say, it's easy for us to say, sometimes it's hard for us to live, but it's never been about Jesus pleasing us. He did some great things for us, there's no doubt about it. He made an amazing sacrifice. His grace, his mercy is incredible. But it's never been about Jesus coming to earth to serve us, to please us. As disciples, our mission, our goal is to please him. Amen. Is to live our lives to be what he wants us to be and to continue in that direction. Peter had to learn that lesson. You know, Peter, kind of impetuous, he was one of those guys that kind of acted before he thought sometimes. Great man of faith, great walk. He was on point when he started the church in Acts, and as he moved on from there, we see him being a tremendous leader in the first church. But his time with Jesus, he had to learn some of his lessons the hard way. Let's look at the first of that in chapter 8, verse 31. He then began to teach them. Well, let's start in 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Cue the a cappella song there. Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about them. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, and he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Think about this a moment. What mistake did Peter make there? What direction was he going that was obviously dangerous, obviously of great concern to Jesus? We don't see Jesus treating one of his disciples, at least as it was written harshly like this, in any other place that I can remember. This was a pretty harsh phrase, a pretty harsh statement. I imagine it was painful to hear, to have Jesus turn his back on him and say, "Get behind me, Satan." And yet that's what took place in this. Obviously, whatever his mistake was, it's not one that we want to repeat. You see, in the first part of the passage, Jesus had asked, who do people think I am? They said, John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets, coming back, reincarnated, sort of. Jesus said, "Who do you think I am?" And Peter plainly said, his statement of faith couldn't be more clear. "You are the Christ, Son of God." Peter had no problem accepting that Jesus was this Messiah that had been foretold by the prophets hundreds of years before, and for whom the Jews had been awaiting all this time. And we have to remember that in Peter's day, there were a number of false prophets. There were a number of false messiahs who had come to the forefront. Many of them believing that this was the time that God was going to call his Messiah forth because of the oppression that they were receiving at the hands of the Romans. But their stories went pretty similarly. They would draw a crowd, they would start teaching and preaching, and people would lift them up. "I'm the Messiah, I'm the one that God has sent." And usually what it involved was taking up arms against the Romans to try to get them out of Jerusalem usually. And as they would gather a crowd and arm them in any way that they could, and they'd start to take the battle to the Romans would defeat them soundly. That most of the followers would drop their weapons or whatever they were holding and just blend in, melt in with the crowd. But a few of the followers who would fight to the end would be rounded up with this leader, and all of them would be marched to their death. Vivid images that would be held of men walking behind this leader, this false Messiah, with a cross on their back, marching up to the top of the hill or wherever they went so that they could meet their demise. so that they would be killed. That was the vision that Peter was recalling, undoubtedly, as Jesus begins to talk about his death. We can see that it disturbs Peter at some basic level, that it upsets him when Jesus talks about his death. It wasn't the first time. He just started talking plainly about it. And Peter had finally had enough, and we don't know what he said, but he rebuked Jesus. Jesus, you got to stop talking about this death stuff. Not sure exactly where you're going with it or what it means, but of course you're the Messiah. You can't die. You got to talk about the right stuff, the good stuff. And it's at that point that Jesus turned his back and said the words that he said. They were harsh words. But he's saying to Peter, man doesn't get to dictate to God what the Messiah looks like. God's going to dictate that to man. You see, Peter, and he didn't realize it because and it wasn't his fault. He was taught it from a very young age, what this Messiah was supposed to look like. So he had a very narrow view of Messiah. Messiah was someone who was coming to save Israel at that point in time and to make Israel a great nation again and to rule on the throne of David forever. But Jesus came, and God's vision of Messiah was for him to save the world, the entire world, for generations. Peter could never have seen you and I sitting here today thinking about the things that took place back then that led us to where we are now. Peter's view was narrow. God's view, God's vision was broad. So with Peter's words ringing in his ears, Jesus calls the crowd to him. And he gave the message that Robin read for us. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for the gospel will save it. Whoever's ashamed of me and my words before men, I'll be ashamed of them before my Father in heaven. Again, you can almost hear those words being tailored to strike at the heart of what Peter had told him, the shaming that Peter had given him for what he said. But Jesus said, it comes down to commitment. It comes down to what you're willing to give up to be a disciple of Jesus. First of all, you've got to deny yourself. It's not about you. It's not about your personal agenda. It's not, I'm going to serve Jesus, but I want to go to the bars too, regardless of what kind of damage it's doing to my family. It's not, I want to serve Jesus, but I want to keep my hobbies and the things that I enjoy. He can't have those. It's not Jesus plus anything. It's just Jesus. Amen. It's just being his disciple and living life the way he wants us to live it, in self-denial, putting him in first place and nothing else is even close. And he said, take up your cross. Man, remember the images that I told you of these false messiahs had to have come to mind as he told his disciples that. Of these men who were the closest followers of these false messiahs or these false generals marching up behind this general, while the rest of them had kind of melted away into the crowd. Jesus said, don't you dare be one of those who melt away into the crowd. If you follow me and the going gets tough, I need you to stick with me. I need you to stay when others are leaving. I need you to be about serving even when others say it's too difficult, it's too hard, it takes too much time, people don't like what I'm doing. You got to stay. Take up your cross. And then he said, and follow me. And in following me, he means doing what I do, walking as I walked, living as I lived. Neil, in his lesson last week, talked about touching the untouchables, and I hope you were able to consider about what that means in your life, to touch people who others consider to be untouchable. And we see so much of that in Jesus' life, things that he did that just cut against the grain of his culture and really of human nature. And often that's exactly what God asks us to do, to live a life that cuts against the grain of human nature. It doesn't mean that we can't do the things that we enjoy, but it might mean that we don't do them alone. Listen, if we're living according to the kingdom purpose, and we've talked about that before, what's the kingdom purpose? Anybody remember what we talked about? What's the kingdom purpose? reconciling man to God, right? That's the kingdom purpose. I'll ask this question again, so remember that answer. Reconciling man to God, that's the kingdom purpose. And how do we get that done? Making disciples. The purpose of the kingdom is reconciling man to God. We get that done by making disciples. And that's what Jesus commanded his followers to do and what he commands us to do if we hold ourselves to be a follower of his. That's what he wants us to do. To live our lives with that purpose in mind. What's your purpose? Do you have a purpose in life? What would you call that? You know, a lot of times young folks in high school and college, they're kind of trying to figure out what that purpose is. But the big picture is that purpose is to follow Jesus, regardless of what that means. Letting him to lead us in the direction that we should go. Letting him show us how we can be useful in his kingdom. May mean sometimes that it doesn't mean we necessarily have to change a lot of what we do, but we may have to change who we do it with. If we're about making disciples, we may have to not as much do things just with our friends and those that we know already, but start involving new people in the things that we do. Start allowing those things to be opportunities to have spiritual, meaningful conversations. If you like fishing, don't give up fishing. Take someone with you, right? Take someone with you. Whoever said amen, I would go if you want. I will go with you. Yeah, he does. And so think about what that means in terms of how does disciple making fit in with your life scheme, with your life plan, with the script that you see on your way forward? How does it happen? It does mean that we may have to give up some things that may not be according to that purpose that we're living our lives towards. It may mean that we have to stop doing things that scream hypocrisy. And it may mean that we have to stop doing things that could possibly bring reproach upon our family or upon our church. It means that we have to engage in the church. Engage in the relationships here that help us to move forward according to that goal. And sometimes when it means engaging with church, it means engaging with people that you love but you don't like all that well sometimes, right? I mean, admit it, that happens. In any church family, especially a family this size, it's going to be that way. And yet we engage with them in our life purpose, in our life direction. So how do we avoid making Peter's mistake? Again, what was Peter's mistake? He was trying to fit Jesus into his box, right? He was trying to say, no, Jesus, this is the way you're supposed to live. This is the way things are supposed to go down. It's supposed to happen this way. Doesn't involve death. Doesn't involve rising again and those kind of things because it's supposed to happen this way. And Jesus said, that's not a choice you get to make. So in any way that we're trying to fit Jesus into our box rather than to live our lives in his and being what he wants us to be, we're making Peter's mistake. To avoid that, we think of purpose. We think of living our lives with purpose. Living our lives working together for the purpose of the kingdom and being what God wants us to be. When we think about that purpose, again, what's the purpose of the kingdom? Reconciling man to God, all right? And how do we get that done? We'll make disciples, that's right. It's interesting that the church, that Jesus brings the church into being to accomplish this purpose. To be a fellowship that's about making disciples. That's about helping one another to grow in our faith and being a family together, but also just as important is the outreach, the sharing of the gospel with others, the sharing of our faith with others. And the nice thing about being involved in a church like this is that you never have to do it alone. We're not going to agree on everything, and that's sure, but we have to work in harmony with one another. It's like singing a song. Sometimes when everybody's singing the same song in the same way, it's called unison musically, and there's no distinction between the two. But if you've grown up in a non-instrumental church of Christ like this, we know about harmony, right? We know what that takes. We know it doesn't mean that everybody's singing the same part all the time. We're singing different parts, but we're doing so in a way that blends together. when voices join together, they either blend or they clash. And I tell you, there's not much difference. But there's not much of an in-between there. They either blend or they clash. When voices clash, it's hard to listen to. When voices blend, it sounds really good. And we need to be a part of that song where the voices blend. Gary, do you remember that song we sang a while back? Do you remember how that starts? Let's go ahead and show them. This is unison, singing a song just with one part.
La 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 la.
And I can join in with another part.
La 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 la. La 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 All I do is ask for your forgiveness. You already made reply. Since he came, my heart is filled with gladness. I won't ever have to die. Sing it if you know it. La 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 la
All right, very good. Thank you. That's what I'm saying we should do as a church. We should sing in harmony. We should work together for the purpose of the kingdom. But it means that each one of us have to live our lives according to that purpose. We'll never have the kind of harmony that God calls us to have, that He wants us to have, if each of us aren't singing our part. If we're not singing the part that we're given to blend with the rest, not trying to fit the church or anyone else or certainly Jesus into our box, but living in His box, doing His will, being obedient to His call, looking at the purpose of the kingdom, reconciling man to God, and doing what we can to make disciples. It's all about being on mission. It's all about denying ourselves, taking up our cross regardless of the consequences, regardless of where it leads, regardless of the way it doesn't meet our expectations, that we take up our cross and we just follow Him. Follow Jesus, doing what He did, being what He wants us to be, being on mission, living life with purpose. The song that we're singing is a beautiful song. It's a song that has been sung for thousands of years. The lyrics are the gospel. And the song is always about one. It's about Jesus. What song are you singing? What's the purpose that you have in life? Are you living in this harmony that God calls us to, that He's looking for? If not, your time this morning is to do it. It's to make your life blend with the gospel. Blend in harmony with others who are listening to the voice of the Spirit, who are striving to be what God wants them to be and walking in His ways. We don't always have to agree, but we need to try to blend. We need to try to be that blend. Be that song and live that song before others. You need to change the way that you walk in some ways to match your purpose, the purpose that you've been given. This morning is a great time to do that. We'd love to hear your thoughts and prayers. We're going to have people standing around the room, a couple of people in the foyer in the back, and they would love to pray with you about this very thing, living according to purpose, or if you have another thing on your heart that you want to share with them. Again, this won't be made public unless you specifically ask it to be made public. It'll be just between you and them. If this morning is a morning where you've been thinking or God's leading you to put on Jesus Christ in baptism and to begin that walk, to begin that living out that purpose, to own the purpose of the kingdom, and to begin your journey in being what God wants you to be, this morning is a great morning to do that too. We'd love to help you with that. Whatever you need, we ask that you come and let us know in one way or another as we stand and sing this song to encourage you.
Oh, to Jesus.